Hello, Chem 1A. This is Chapter 11, Lecture Video 6, and we're going to be discussing what's known as valence bond theory. This is the first of two theories to explain how bonding actually occurs in our molecules. We've learned that covalent bonds are when we share valence electrons, but what does that actually look like in the molecule itself, right? We learned in an earlier chapter that electrons kind of hang out in orbitals. Valence bond theory takes that information and applies it to a chemical bond. What is happening to our orbitals that our electrons are hanging out in when we form a bond? The other type of theory that broaches this exact subject we'll talk about at the end of this lecture video, or at the end of this chapter, and that is what's known as molecular orbital theory. Both theories have their advantages and disadvantages. So that's why we have to cover both theories as to how bonds actually occur. So let's talk about what valence bond theory really states and what it kind of is all based on. It states that orbitals must overlap to form a bond between two atoms. So we're sharing these electrons, but what's happening is the actual orbitals that these electrons are in are overlapping with an orbital from the other atom that is in the bond, and that's where the electrons that are in the bond kind of hang out within the overlap of those orbitals. So each overlapping orbital can hold a maximum of 2 electrons with opposite spin. Typically, where these electrons come from is 1 electron from each of the atoms. So if we have a bond between hydrogen and fluorine, for instance, hydrogen donates its 1 valence electron to the bond, and fluorine donates its 1 unpaired electron from the bond to the bond, so that we have that overlapping orbital and the covalent bond is formed. Bonding electrons, this is kind of a very sciencey way of saying this. Bonding electrons are localized with a higher probability of being found between the nuclei of the bonding atoms. Electrons are simultaneously associated with each nuclei. What this really is saying is that if I have element X and element Y and they're being bound together, the electrons that are in the bond are most likely to be found between the two atoms, not like over here somewhere, right? Probably not here, probably there, which hopefully makes just common sense, right? If the bond is between these two, it's probably the electrons that are participating in the bond are probably also in between the two atoms. The second sentence there, both electrons are simultaneously associated with both nuclei, has to do with we basically count both these electrons as part of X, and at the same time both of the electrons are counted as part of element Y. This is what we mean when we talk about an octet, right? We count those twice technically, once for both atoms in the bond. So valence bond theory breaks all covalent bonds into 2 types of bonds. And so this is all for covalent bonds, but if we look at those types, we can say, hey, we have something called a sigma bond. That's what the symbol is here. And sigma bonds occur through the overlap along an internuclear axis. What that means is if I have element X here and element, we'll say Y on the other side, and we're going to bond these two, the nuclei of these two elements, the overlap is occurring directly along an internuclear axis, like this dashed line I drew. So in other words, if we think about like an s orbital, spherical thing, overlapping between these two, notice that this overlap here is occurring along that internuclear axis. This would be defined as a sigma bond, therefore. The other type of bond is called a pi bond, and this is due to the overlap above and below the internuclear axis. So let's take that same example. We have X and Y, and they're going to attach to each other. I'm going to move them slightly closer together because I'm not the best artist. Again, the internuclear axis is right here. In this scenario, we could think of like 2 p orbitals that happen like this. The shapes of them kind of are oblong and they go up and down. And if we have these two kind of like overlapping like that, again, sorry, not the best artist. right? You can kind of see our overlap is occurring both below and above the internuclear axis. And this is where we have like two p orbitals side by side overlapping. This would be considered a pi bond. And so we can break down all of our bonds into either a sigma bond or a pi bond when we're talking about covalent bonds. Now there's some other stuff that we need to talk about in terms of these two new vocab words. When bonding occurs along the bonding axis, it's referred to as sigma bond. So this is a little bit more digital friendly picture. So our overlap is occurring directly along that axis of the two elements, nuclei or atoms, nuclei. The electrons are going to be in the space directly between those two nuclei. These black dots here are my electrons in this case. Now, one of the things you should know is that all single bonds are sigma bonds. Every single bond in a molecule is always a sigma bond. So if we look at like CH4 and look at its Lewis structure, it looks something like this. Each one of these bonds in this structure, this one, this one, this one, and this one, all four of them are sigma bonds because they're all single bonds. And so that's one thing you should be able to kind of figure out. Let's talk about double bonds or triple bonds. When we have multiple bonds present, like a double or a triple bond, one of those bonds is always a sigma bond. All other bonds in that structure are considered pi bonds. So if you look at this example here, here's our internuclear axis. This overlap here is our sigma bond. The overlaps above and below these guys this is our pi bond, or pi bond. This guy here is our sigma bond. We only have one pi bond here. Both of these two are part of the pi bond. This is an example of where the overlap is occurring above and below the nuclei. And this is a double bond. So if we look at double bonds, you can see that a double bond is composed of one sigma bond and one pi bond. So for instance, if I looked at a different Lewis structure, something like this, I could ask you, for instance, how many sigma bonds are present and how many pi bonds are present? And the answer is there are 3 sigma bonds and 1 pi bond. All the single bonds are sigma bonds. So we have, this is a sigma bond and this is a sigma bond. And one of these lines is also a sigma bond because one of the bonds in a double bond is a sigma bond. On the other hand, this one pi bond is the other bond in the double bond. And so just like this, we can count how many sigma bonds and pi bonds are present in a molecule. Let's talk about we'll talk about the different types of sigma bond formation you can have. So if we look at this, right, here is an s orbital. It's a 1s orbital on hydrogen. Here's another 1s orbital on hydrogen. If we bring these together and form H2, notice that the overlap here is happening directly along the internuclear axis. This is going to be a sigma bond. So if we overlap an s orbital with another s orbital, we're always going to get a sigma bond. If we overlap a 1s orbital like here with a 2p orbital here, the overlap again is occurring right here somewhere. And again, that's occurring along the internuclear axis. This is forming the single bond in HF, the sigma bond here. So if you overlap an s orbital with a p orbital, you also get a sigma bond. Now, depending on how you overlap two p orbitals, right? So I have a p orbital here and a 2p orbital here. They're both 2p orbitals. But if we have one orbital and 2 orbitals, right, we have a total of 2p orbitals here, both at energy level 2. If we bring those together, there's actually 2 ways to do this. One where it's what I like to say is end to end
If you bring p orbitals together end to end, notice that the overlap does occur along the bonding axis, making it, again, a sigma bond. But if you overlap p orbitals side by side, like here, above and below the axis, so this would be a pi bond. So there's only one way I'm going to teach you how to make pi bonds. There's more than one in actuality, but the one way that we know in this class how to make a pi bond is through side by side p orbital overlap. That's the only way. And you should know that phrase because it's going to, anytime I ask you to describe how a pi bond formed, that's what the answer is. It's side by side p orbital overlap. So again, if we look at these scenarios, we have two s orbitals overlapping to start with. That's going to form a sigma bond. Two p orbitals will overlap, but only, again, end to end forms the sigma bond. And an overlap of an s with a p orbital in the middle here also forms a sigma bond. So bonds, right? So we talked about pi bonds already. They occur through the overlap of side by side p orbitals. In this bond here, this is acetylene, we have a triple bond between the two carbons. And how this is happening is one of these bonds is a sigma. This triple bond contains one sigma bond and two pi bonds. All triple bonds contain one sigma bond and two pi bonds. And you can kind of see where we're at here, right? This overlap here is our sigma. And then this overlap with this tube down here at the bottom is one of the pi bonds. And then this overlap here and this one down here is the second pi bond. So it's hard to kind of see, but the digital image makes it a lot better than anything I could draw, right? At the end of the day, we have a sigma bond here. This is one pi bond, these tubes here, and these tubes are the second pi bond. We also have another sigma bond here with the hydrogens. Now we're showing these bonds. Here, let's color code this a little bit. So these are our sigma bonds in the molecule, this one, and that overlap. Going this one of these, and this one. Then we have our two pi bonds, right? One of them here, this tube, and this tube. That's one pi bond, like I showed earlier, and then the other tube, this tube, and that tube is the other pi bond.